Hello everyone! Once again, I am back with another tutorial. Today we're going to be making a Cinderella Maid inspired apron. I will be using the Simplicity pattern 8316. This is such an adorable apron, and who doesn't love anything Disney? When I was thinking of how I wanted to make this apron, I don't know if it's because my hair is back to blonde. I was definitely getting some Cinderella vibes from it. I think her whole maid outfit definitely fits with this. So let's go ahead and put together an apron. So from this pattern, I ended up mixing and matching a little bit. So I'm using the skirt portion from view C and I'm combining it with the top from view A. People always tend to think that you have to make it exactly like it is on the pattern picture. That's definitely not true. You can totally mix and match different pieces and how you want to make it. For my fabrics, I'm just using regular cotton, so pre-wash your fabrics before you cut out your pieces to accommodate for any shrinking. For your notions, all you're going to need is the 2 packages of 1/2 inch wide double fold bias tape. I will be making my apron in a size medium. I'm only providing the amounts of fabric and notions needed for this exact apron. But if you want to go with something more close to the package, you can refer to the chart on the back to know exactly what you'll need. For our pattern pieces, we're going to need number 1, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, and number 10. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cut out all of our pieces. So in the tan fabric, you're going to cut out the skirt, which is cut on the fold. For the white, you're going to cut out the apron and your pocket, and then go ahead and make sure you add all your marks and notches. For the pocket, we're just going to measure out 2 strips of the black ribbon, and you're going to use the placement line for the trim as your guide. These happen to be 6 inches, so you're going to cut out another 2 6-inch strips. So you should have 4 in total. And then you're going to cut out 2 2-inch strips. And also in the white, we're going to cut out the waistband and the waist ties. For the brown fabric, we're going to cut out the heart, making sure to mark all of your dots and notches. The last thing you're cutting out in the blue fabric is the shoulder straps. First thing we're going to do is grab our bias tape, and we're going to have to make this longer than the 3 yards it already is. So we're going to attach 2 ends together. Go ahead and open up your bias tape all the way on both ends that you're attaching. Take one side and you're going to flip it over. Place one end on top of the other so that you have the outside of each strip facing each other. Turn one end to make a 90-degree angle. You want to make sure that the edges line up. And then we're going to be sewing from one corner all the way to the other. So you should have one open corner. We're going to cut off the excess fabric, leaving about 1/4 of an inch of a seam allowance. And then we can go ahead and fold the bias tape back up. If you want, you can go ahead and iron this to help it stay closed. So with our bias tape, one side is a little bit longer than the other. If you look closely, you can see a little lip hanging out on one side compared to the other side. That looks completely even. So the top side is going to be the shorter side. It's made like this so that way the bottom will be for sure caught in the stitch. We're going to grab our skirt piece. We're going to add the bias tape down all 3 edges. So as you can see here, I'm picking the side that has the lip that shows, and you're just going to open it up and place the edge of the fabric directly to the middle of your bias tape. And we're going to sew this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. When we get to one of the corners, we're going to stop about 3/8 inches before the edge, and you're going to open up your bias tape and you're going to kind of fold it so that you can place the bottom edge into the center of your bias tape in the other direction. You should have a little extra fabric hanging out from the corner. We're going to kind of pinch this and fold it down. Then just try your best to even it out so it looks nice and neat. And then we can continue sewing in the other direction. You're going to do the same thing on the other corner as well. Once we finish adding the bias tape, just go back and sew down the other edge of the corner that's open, just to secure it a little more. We're going to grab our apron piece next, and we're going to add a hem. We're going to start by folding the edge over by 3/8 inches and ironing it down. Make sure to take your time around the curve so that it looks nice and neat. Sew this down with a 1/16 inch seam allowance. Then we're going to fold over another 3/8 inches and iron that down as well. Then we're going to add our white lace trim. You're going to sew on your lace trim at a 1/16 inch seam allowance, and I'm just making sure that the thread from my ruffle or the inside edge of the raw hem of the lace is lined up with your needle. So I'm just taking my time matching them up before I sew it down. For my lace trim, I ended up just making some ruffles in the sizes that I needed, which worked just as well. We're going to base stitch the top of our apron. So before you start sewing, you want to make sure that you have about a 3 or 4 inch tail of thread. We're going to do our first base stitch at a 1/16 inch seam allowance. When you get to the end, make sure you leave another 3 or 4 inch tail of thread. Then we're going to do the same thing at a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you want to make sure that you have a tail at the beginning and end of your stitch. We're going to start working on our pockets. We're going to fold over the top edge 1/4 inches and iron it down. And then I'm marking where the fold line is from our pattern piece. We're going to flip them over and fold it down the opposite way where we marked the fold line, and iron this down as well. We're going to sew a 5/8 inch seam allowance around the edge. Then we're going to go back and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance just around the corners. So you should have something like this. From here, I'm just going to snip off a little bit of the corner on each pocket. Since we're turning this out, it'll make a nicer point. Go ahead and turn out that top edge, and you can use a chopstick to push out the corners. And then we're going to iron in the edges, and you're folding it in where we sewed on the seam allowance. So take your time ironing the fabric down at the corners so that you keep them nicely curved. I later realized that the small base stitch on these corners was supposed to be gathered slightly to help curve in those edges a little easier. So when you sew these, make sure you leave a small tail of thread on each end so you can gather them in a little bit, and it'll help create that nice curve when we go to iron it down at this point. You're going to do this to both pockets. We're going to start making the ribbon bows that go on top of our pockets. So grab 2 of your 6-inch strips and we're going to mark the middle. The pattern actually calls for bias tape for the bows on our pockets, but I thought the ribbon gave it a little bit of a nicer touch. But if you don't have ribbon, feel free to use that extra bias tape. From here, you're going to fold in each end so that it overlaps the center by 1/4 inch on each side. And then we're going to sew right down the middle to create our bow. On the other 2 6-inch strips, you're going to mark the middle on them as well. And then you're going to line up the middle of your bow with the middle that you marked on your strip. You're going to grab your needle and thread, and we're going to sew these together. Then we're going to grab one of the 2-inch strips, and we're going to wrap it around the middle, tucking in the edges on both sides. And then I'm going to close this up with a slip stitch. I do use a slip stitch a few times in this tutorial, so I'll leave a video link down below for you where I break it down a little more so you can see exactly how to do one if you've never done one before. Going back to our pocket, you can kind of see where that top fold ends, and that's where we're going to line up our bow. Make sure your bow is centered, and then you're going to fold in the edges of the ribbon to the edge of your pocket. Then we're going to sew both sides of the ribbon down. I ended up deciding to fold the edge of the ribbon over instead of tucking it under. I'm sewing as close to the edge of the ribbon I can get, going down one side, and then when I get to the bow, I'm lifting up one side of the bow to sew down, and then I'm going back down the other side. Do this to the other side of your ribbon as well, and then same thing to the other pocket. Line up the top corners of your pocket to the dots you marked from your pattern. Go ahead and sew this down with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then I did go back through and I sewed it down at a 1/16 inch seam allowance just to make it a little more secure. You don't have to do both like I did, so if you're only going to do one, I would recommend doing the 1/16 inch seam allowance instead. From our apron, grabbing the two top threads from our base stitch, I'm just going to gently pull, and this is going to gather the apron. And you're going to gather it up to match to the dots that you marked on your skirt. Gather it enough to line up with the edge of your skirt, and then you're just going to move around your gathers to distribute them evenly. Then once you like the way it looks, go ahead and pin it down. We're going to sew these together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. We're going to grab our waistband piece next, and the dot you marked on your waistband should line up with the edge of the skirt. Line up the other edge and your centers as well, and then you can evenly pin this together. Sew this on with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Go ahead and cut off half of your seam allowance because you want to get rid of the extra fabric. And then I went ahead and ironed my seam allowance toward my waistband so that everything laid nicely. On the other edge of your waistband, go ahead and fold it over 5/8 inches and iron that down. And then same thing, we're going to cut off half of that seam allowance. We're going to grab both of our waist type pieces and we're going to fold them in half You're going to sew down one short edge and across the long edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Do this for both straps. Once again, we're going to cut off half of the seam allowance on both strips. And I'm also snipping off the corners to help make that nice point when we turn them out. Turn both of your straps inside out. You can use a chopstick. The next part of this, we're going to grab our shoulder strap pieces and we're going to fold this in half. We'll be sewing down the long side with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. We're going to cut off half of that seam allowance on both pieces. And then we can go ahead and flip these both inside out. Once again, you can iron it down to make those creases nice and neat. For both ends of our shoulder straps, we're going to sew a base stitch of a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Starting with the edge that's curved, making sure that shorter point of the curve is facing toward the middle of our heart. We're going to line up the inside of our strap with the dots that we marked on our heart, making sure that our base stitch lines up with the 3/8 inch seam allowance that we made earlier. Tuck in your ends of the strap so they're in the middle of your heart, and then we're going to lay the other half of our heart on top. Go ahead and pin down the edges. We're going to sew around the edge with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, making sure to leave about a 2 or 3 inch gap. Personally, I felt like the straps sat a little funny, matching them up with the dots, so I moved that inside edge of the strap toward the middle about an inch more, and I felt like it sat a little bit better. Once you pin these straps on, you can put this up against yourself to see how it lays. That way you can adjust the straps if you want to before we sew them down. We're going to make a tiny little snip at that top curve, but make sure you don't cut past the thread. This is just going to help that point be a little sharper. Then go ahead and turn this inside out. Grab your iron and go ahead and press this out. And then we're going to do a top stitch of a 1/16 inch seam allowance. We're going to grab the bottom portion of our apron that we made earlier, and we're going to line up the bottom dots that were on our heart with the dots that are indicated in the middle of our waistband. And we're going to sew from small dot to small dot at that 1/16 inch seam allowance. So we're just going to sew right over what we just did. We're going to turn this around and we're going to slip stitch that waistband section to the back layer of our heart. So while you're doing this, you just want to make sure you're not going through to the front. Just take your time and make sure that you're only picking up that back layer of your heart. For those open ends of our shoulder straps, go ahead and serge the edge, or you can zigzag stitch over it just to keep it from fraying. And then we're going to take our right side and cross it over to the left side of our waistband. And I'm lining up that base stitch with the top edge of our waistband. And you can go ahead and pin that together. And then take your left shoulder strap and cross it over to your right side of your waistband. Doing the same thing on that side as well. To sew this on, you can do a 1/16 inch seam allowance, but I wanted it a little bit closer than that. So I'm just sewing right before the edge, and then I'm going to back stitch back across for added security. And sew on the other strap as well. And your apron is finished. I'm really happy how this came out. It has such a great fit and a good amount of length to the skirt. I think this is just so girly and so fun. Especially if you're a baker, I think this would be really cute to bake in. This would be such a great gift for anyone who loves to be in the kitchen or even just doing chores around the house. Whenever an apron is needed, you can throw this on and hopefully it'll make you feel a little more put together. I could think of no better character to inspire this apron more than Cinderella. I think at some point we all kind of feel like Cinderella when we've got a lot to do. Once again, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you'll be back for the next one, and thanks for watching. Bye!